Greetings from Washington. I'm here with Ambassador Jeffrey, whom many of you may know. He served as the U.S. ambassador in Turkey from 2008 to 2010, and he was also the ambassador of the U.S. in Iraq from 2010 to 2012. But we also know Ambassador Jeffrey as the Deputy National Security Advisor from 2007 to 2008. And he was also Secretary's Special Representative for Syria engagement and the Special Envoy to the Global Coalition to defeat ISIS until November 2020. So I'm here with Ambassador Jeffrey in a Washington cafe. It's Georgetown Cafe, actually, which is run by two Turkish sisters who are very good friends of mine. So I'm really very happy to have Ambassador Jeffrey here. Ambassador, welcome to my YouTube show. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Yeah. Thank you, Tulia.
Thank you. This has been really a very interesting time. I've been here in Washington for about 10 days. The election is over. There are so many different voices in town, and people are having difficulty to understand what the Trump second presidency would mean. But we are all focused on the foreign policy. So how do you approach to Trump's second presidency in terms of his foreign policy? What do you look for?
Well, first of all, no one can predict what any president's policy will be until each day that president takes that policy decision. President Trump, for various reasons, is particularly difficult to predict, even though we've had 4 years experience with him. And one reason for that is take a look at the world today. This is the most dangerous period, with the possible exception of the Cuban Missile Crisis, since World War II. We have two major wars, Ukraine and the Middle East, with the possibility of a third in East Asia. And in the midst of this, there are great questions about the role of the United States, still by far the most powerful country, and at the center of a global collective security system that has worked pretty well since the early days after World War II, with the creation of NATO and various other things that, of course, Turkey was very much involved in. The Truman Doctrine, which involved Turkey as well as Greece, Korean War involving Turkey, and then Turkey's entry into NATO. Turkey has been a very big player in this. The problem is that among the influences on President Trump, you have some who are no longer interventionists. The kind of interventionism we've seen in the Bush administration is no longer being actively pushed by major elements of the political class in America. But you see many people who are identified with the classic maintenance of collective security, strong role in NATO, and so forth. But then you have others, such as Vice President-elect Vance, who believe in a more, if not isolationist America, a more playing off of former President Andrew Jackson in the 19th century, Jacksonian foreign policy of a strong America, but very selective on what it does internationally.
So it's not totally isolationist.
Not totally isolationist, but quite different from the Biden administration and most before it. And we don't know where President Trump is going to come down, because at the end of the day, he maintained the collective security system during his first administration. But now maintaining that collective security system can bring you closer to war. In fact, U.S. forces have been repeatedly directly involved in combat during the last year in the Middle East. And of course, we are in a major confrontation, even though we're not shooting, with Russia over Ukraine. So the stakes are higher, and that introduces more uncertainty. And it's understandable. That's how Americans feel. That's how all of our friends around the world feel.
Right. So I've been listening to the U.S. media. MSNBC and Fox News have two different interpretations of what Trump's foreign policy be about when he talks about ending the wars, like what it would mean to end the war in Ukraine and what it would mean to end the war in the Middle East. How do you approach to it? How will the president-elect will shape these two wars, what it would mean to end these wars?
Well, not only President Trump, but President Biden and probably any other president would be interested in ending these wars because they pose major dangers to the regions involved. They pose major dangers to us, and not least to the people who are impacted, the people of Gaza, the people of Lebanon, the people of Ukraine. The problem is you want to end wars in a way that do not prepare the way for bigger wars. So you have to end wars in a way that those who started them, broadly speaking, Russia in the case of Ukraine and Iran and its proxies in the case of the Gaza Middle East war, do not feel encouraged to just start another war in a year or 5 years.
So how about Mr. Biden's decision to allow the Ukrainian forces to use American weapons inside to hit the targets inside the Russian territory? There's also a lot of debate whether this is going to escalate the war, and they've already exchanged some fire since Biden has taken this decision.
One of the less admirable but understandable characteristics of foreign policy under President Biden, but under most presidents, has been this idea that in any military situation, the first answer is de-escalate, the second answer is ceasefire.
Yes.
But again, that may end the fighting, even end a war, but it only is good for you, good for me, good for your listeners and viewers if it prevents a bigger war in 5 or 10 years. The British and French stopped a war over Czechoslovakia in 1938 by opening the door to a much bigger war several years later. And that is the example we all keep in mind in looking at how to do foreign policy. In terms of those missiles, I believe that President Biden, if anything, was too slow in providing, as well as the British, not so much the British, but the Germans in particular, have been too slow in providing weapon systems to Ukraine. Now, these weapon systems will not change the outcome of the war. This war is basically a war of attrition, favoring to some degree Russia, but not too much. It's been 1,000 days of fighting, and how much territory has Russia actually won against a country 1/4 of its size? So it is still basically a war of attrition. But providing weapons more quickly that can do more damage will not reverse the situation and allow a military victory for Ukraine, but it does two things. One is it puts Russia under somewhat more military pressure, which is good if we want to have a negotiated end. Secondly, it shows that American and European determination to take risks to support Ukraine. This is very important for Putin's calculus, and it's been an area where I think President Biden has been weak by delaying these deliveries. So I'm very happy he delivered them. But at the same time, on the other hand, if he's been too conservative and restrained with Ukrainian President Zelensky on weapons deliveries, he's been too embracing on this idea of, well, however the war ends, that's your decision. No, it isn't. We didn't take that position with Kuwait in 1991, with Korea in 1993, with Vietnam in 1972, and to some degree with Israel today. We are very much on the ground with our partners, telling them that in return for our support, assistance, weapons, or troops, we have to have a say, along with you, in how to end this war. This is what President Biden has not done. This is what President Trump, I believe, will do.
Okay, that's important. And in terms of the Middle East, I hear in town that there is a lot of distress about Turkey's support for Hamas. About 36 congressmen wrote a letter to Secretary Blinken and also to the National Intelligence Director, Avril Haines, to provide them a classified briefing on this. And I also hear that there are some, people who are really voicing some concern over Turkey's decision to avert Israeli President Herzog's travel to Azerbaijan to attend the climate summit that Turkey didn't allow its passage through its air space. How do you approach to it that Turkey always comes as as an opponent to Israel in the Washington circles?
Well, this is something new from October 7th. You remember the Turkish and Israeli leaders met just before October 7th, and President Herzog in particular has been very much in the lead in reaching out to Israel. You would know better than I the internal views of the Turkish population towards the current Gaza struggle and the broader Middle East. I think there's a lot of sympathy for certainly the Palestinian people. And Erdogan is the leader of a democratic political system. He has to take that into consideration. I think that the embrace of Hamas specifically, as opposed to embrace of Palestinians, is a mistake, because the rest of the world, most of the major countries Turkey deals with are in the Middle East or Europe or North America. Broadly speaking, those countries all think officially or unofficially that Hamas is a terrorist organization and is a threat to regional peace. Now, you can come up with 100 votes in the UN from Africa, from East Asia, from South America, who would differ. But A, those countries do not have, as we say, skin in the game. And secondly, they're really of very little importance to Turkey. I mean, even China and Russia are a bit nervous about Hamas. Neither like how the situation Iran has put the Middle East in, because it endangers Russia's main interest, Syria, and it endangers China's main interest, the free flow of trade, including particularly hydrocarbons, in and out of the Middle East. So I don't think it's a smart foreign policy move to be all that supportive of Hamas, and we will see how the Turkish government continues. I think that there is certainly some limits to that support. And in terms of criticism in Washington, over 40 years, some people in Congress always find something to target Turkey on. There's always something that Ankara does that at the moment people don't like, and it's more a reflection of, in my view, a discomfort of an important country that we need very much to help us maintain global and regional security, that often goes its own way because it has understandably legitimate different interests. That's hard for Washington to understand. It's very hard for us to understand that with France, for example.
Right. I mean, the Turkish government has officially denied some reports that Hamas has moved from Qatar to Turkey. And I guess the congressmen here at the House and also in the Senate are curious to learn it from their own sources as to what it is. But what I do understand you're saying is that if Turkey takes a step forward in that direction, it's going to have even more problems here in Washington in the Trump presidency, right?
I would say we would have to wait and see. First of all, the reality is that Hamas is literally a dying force in the Middle East. The ideas behind Hamas, that is, among some Palestinians, the destruction of Israel, will not die, unfortunately. But Hamas as an organization, as a movement, as the people who control Gaza, that's not going to be around for much longer, any more than the Muslim Brothers who governed Egypt for a few years are around anymore. So it's not that critical an issue for the Middle East. Blocking the flight of Herzog to Azerbaijan, I found in some respects troubling, because in Azerbaijan, you have a very important country that's under pressure from both Iran and Russia. Both Israel and Turkey have very good relations with Azerbaijan, and they basically both, Ankara and Jerusalem, see the importance of Baku and the threats to Baku similarly. So I thought that that was unfortunate. You know, if the flight was being blocked to Poland, it still would have been, I think, a mistake because you don't use your airspace that way. Uh, but I mean, there are countries that might block President Erdogan's flight sometime, and that would be a big mistake. But I think Azerbaijan is sensitive. It's a country under pressure. And again, there are inherent Turkish and Israeli common interests in Azerbaijan.
Ambassador, you know the region very well. When I look at this, time since October 7, 2023, it's not only Hamas, but the PLO is almost over. And when I look at the trends, in my humble capacity, I feel that whatever the next chapter is going to be, it's going to produce even more radicals. Do you have a better,
I'm not
perception?
so sure. Well, first of all, nobody can say.
Well, I'm not saying 100% either, but I just, have this worry because this has gotten really crazy.
But
times.
that's part of the Biden administration's escalation is always wrong. War is always wrong. It never creates anything good. And it always leads to more radicalization and more, Prime Minister Netanyahu gave a speech a few days ago where he listed all of the things that President Biden told him not to do. Much of it in the new book, War, by Bob Woodward, recounts this as well. Not a single step Israel has taken to defend itself since October 7th was initially supported by the Biden administration. It was always de-escalate, don't act, use negotiations. Tony Blinken will fly any place, will convene the UN. And Israel has ignored that. And as a result, Israel has basically destroyed Hamas. It is on the cusp of getting a ceasefire that will actually implement the 2006 UN resolution with Hezbollah, a much decimated Hezbollah in Lebanon, and it has shown Iran to be impotent in supporting its proxies. This is a huge geostrategic change in the region that Israel did over the objections of the United States, because the United States is saying this will just make the region more radical. It might, but let's wait and see. It also might bring stability, because over the last 20 years, and I've been on the ground for much of it, most of the real wars in the Middle East, other than Libya, which is the one that probably is under the best stabilization right now, where Turkey played a big role, have been Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Gaza. And what do they all have in common that Libya doesn't have in common? Major Iranian involvement through proxies. So that is the only really serious security threat to the region, including Turkey right now. I don't deny that Russia and China are trying to have more influence in the Middle East, but right now they're more restrained, as I said, Russia to preserve its Syrian bases and Iran, its trade relationships. I don't deny that there's a threat of Sunni Islamic terrorists, such as the remnants of Daesh or the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda as well, but they have been largely kept under control for the last half decade or more. The main threat is Iran, and Iran has been really dealt a major blow. So we will see. Now, you mentioned Palestine. I believe that the UN was correct in 1947, General Assembly Resolution 182, establishing two states, the state of Israel and an Arab state. And it is important that that occur. The West Bank and Gaza, Golan Heights and East Jerusalem are more complicated, but basically those are occupied territories that Israel legitimately, as a warring power, seized in fighting a war of survival against a massive Arab threat in 1967. Israel has every right to occupy that territory temporarily until there is some kind of resolution of the underlying hostilities or reasons for hostilities, just like the Soviets had the right to occupy Berlin after World War II until 1991, because they had security concerns that had to be met. just like Israel had the right to occupy the Sinai after 1967 for over a decade until there were arrangements on the part of Egypt to satisfy Israeli security concerns. So I look at the situation with the PLO, Hamas, the Palestinians, more as one of resolving an occupation in a way that satisfies Israel's sense of security, especially now. Never a second intifada and never, ever, ever a second October 7th, as opposed to nation building. But we've all got wrapped around the idea of the two-state solution, which means that Israeli withdrawal comes only after you solve the issue of the Palestinian state and governance and people and nation. But that's a big burden on Israel. It has its own nation to worry about. Its main job is, and it's not being done by this Israeli government, is to say, these are the security concerns we need to have met. Just like the Soviets needed certain concerns about Germany and Berlin, just like we the Israelis needed concerns about the Sinai. And when those are met, we will leave. That's what Israel should say and doesn't. The job of creating a Palestinian state is a job for the Palestinians themselves, helped by the broader international community.
Yeah, and also the Arab countries do have a stake in it and probably
Very much
have a
so.
responsibility, but they do not really stand up for resolving the Palestinian issue for, whatever reasons they do have, right?
Well,
I mean, in the last meeting of the Arab countries in Riyadh, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, has for the first time said that what Israel does constitutes some, I don't remember the quotation exactly, but constitutes genocidal actions. And that was the first time he said it, only after Trump was elected. So some people do have a different perception of what Trump's presidency would mean for ending the war in the Middle East, and some have different. So it's just, it's really becoming very difficult to comprehend how this is going to move forward.
My assumption is that the Saudis took that step to underline what the Saudis and the Emiratis in particular have said, that there will be no further progress on the Abraham Accords, the reconciliation of Israel and Arab states in the Gulf and elsewhere, such as Morocco, unless and until Israel takes a different position towards the Palestinians. Now, I think Israel should take a different position towards the Palestinians. As I said, it should basically say, these are the conditions for our withdrawal, and it should not be encouraging the settler movement to seize Palestinian territory in the West Bank. So the Crown Prince is correct in emphasizing that. I disagree with the idea of genocide. Israel has fought a war in Gaza, which is a small area, for a year. And by essentially the Hamas statistics, somewhere roughly 1% of the civilian population have been killed. That's a tragedy because it's a large number, because it's a very big battle, but I don't think it amounts to genocide. It needs to be looked into in terms of individual incidents. The Israelis do that, the international community does that, but I think that talk of genocide is wrong.
Okay, I mean, it's
What about Assad in Syria?
What about Assad in Syria? Well, that's the next topic that we should move into.
No, but I want to stop for that, and I will say, how much have you heard about Assad creating genocide in Syria compared to Israel creating genocide in Gaza, whereas the numbers are far greater and the intention is far different? Assad, with his Russian and Iranian friends, went out to deliberately terrorize and kill massive numbers of civilians, including through barrel bombs, double-tap Russian attacks on the first responders, and, of course, chemical weapons. And I can't say I heard no international complaints about Assad, but compared to what I've heard about Israel, it's nothing.
Well, as one who have been to Iraq and Afghanistan, who have being an eyewitness to what war is, to me, it is very difficult to comprehend the magnitude of the damage this whole thing is causing to civilians. So I wouldn't know how to get to it. I hear your point, but and I'm not really getting into this, verbal dialogue, whether to, call it genocide or not. But to me, the killing needs to come to an end. But and it's just, I hear your point, and thank you so much for being really very candid in terms of helping us how to approach to it, how to see this, and because when I look at it. Some people do argue that Netanyahu is doing it just to save his prime ministry and premiership. And to me, well, you're killing too many people, so this shouldn't be only about it because this is really crazy. I'm not able to comprehend it, Ambassador, so I have my own limits. I've seen it during, many times. But since October 7th, that, attack by Hamas was horrifying. And it's not acceptable. But what has been happening since October 7 is beyond my comprehension too, and this is really very difficult for.
The moment Hamas said we will surrender, we would like safe passage out of here, like the PLO got out of Beirut in 1982.
Yes.
And we will return the hostages if this safe passage is guaranteed. The war would have been over.
Yes.
The problem is Hamas. There was no way the Israelis could allow Hamas to continue on in Gaza because the attack on October 7th had it been joined by Hezbollah and Iran, and there were plans that the Israelis and others have found. The Wall Street Journal actually reported about it a year ago, and then documents were found to substantiate it. The idea was, particularly in the eyes of and mind of Sinwar, that there be a combined attack on all sides to Israel, which could have spelled the end of Israel before we could have helped them.
Do you think Turkey had a role to persuade Hamas to do this much sooner?
What do you mean a role?
Do you think Turkey could had a leverage over Hamas
No.
to bring this
No.
to an end? No.
No.
Okay, that's good.
No, I don't.
All right. And
not Qatar, nor Egypt.
and not Qatar. But Turkey is taking a lot of heat just because of its support to Hamas right now.
Well,
So this is a one-way direction.
Countries take decisions. I think that, as I said, there is domestic support for the Palestinians that's quite strong in Turkey, and any democratic leader has to take that into consideration.
Sure.
I think that more distance to Hamas is both from the standpoint of morality, given Hamas's terrorist background, important, and in terms of Turkey's interests in realpolitik terms, a good idea because it will be able to play a bigger role in the day after. Hamas has no role in the day after, and there's very little left of Hamas. So being able to dial Hamas on your telephone is not going to be very helpful for the new Middle East.
And let's hope that this is not going to produce more radicalized groups in the region, because we're really fed up seeing all these bombings and killings and so. But let me move to Syria, because the Turkish audience is talking, almost daily now, that Trump presidency now would withdraw the U.S. troops from the region, from Syria, and that would create a vacuum, and that Turkey has to fill in this vacuum very fast and has to have a strategy. And they're also claiming that MHP leader Devlet Bahçeli's recent statements at the parliament that PKK leader Öcalan should come and talk at the Dem Party's group meeting in the parliament to call all the PKK militants to put their arms once and for all. And so there is a lot of, trafficking, going round as to what Turkey should do in terms of this Syria theater. How do you approach to it?
I start with the fact that the PKK is a terrorist organization that should end its war against the Republic of Turkey, first of all. Two, anything the government of Turkey can do to encourage the PKK to do that is a good idea. Three, an American withdrawal from northeast Syria would create, as you said, a vacuum. Nobody knows who would fill this vacuum. It could be elements of the PKK that would be far more aggressive against Turkey than the people that are in northeast Syria now. It could be Daesh. Daesh has a capability to reconstitute, as we've seen in Afghanistan, as we've seen in major attacks in Moscow and in Iran. It could be Iran. It could be Hezbollah, which has a presence in Syria. It could be Assad himself, or it could be the Russians. Turkey has the Russians to their east in the Caucasus, obviously in the north, in the Black Sea. To have Russians more active in the south may not be a good idea. So there are a lot of serious problems for Turkey if the U.S. withdraws. I don't think President Trump has taken a final decision. There are many of us who argue from outside that that needs to be very carefully thought through, the implications of it on the fight against Daesh, on the containment of Iran, on stability in the region. I would point out that I think thanks to the actions of various countries in Syria, including the U.S. and Turkey, Assad has stayed out of this terrible war in the Middle East. He is not engaged on the side of Iran and Hezbollah, even though Iran and Hezbollah saved Assad up until the point when the Russians came in. So that's an interesting point, and it argues for continued close cooperation between the U.S. and Turkey for a final solution to Syria that will mean that Syria is no longer a threat to Turkey, to Israel, to Jordan, to Lebanon, to Iraq. And it's a threat in many ways, from the refugees, from the drugs that are sent across the border to Jordan, from the presence of Hezbollah and other Iranian proxy groups, from the presence of various terrorist groups. So therefore, Syria is a problem that needs to be continue to be contained, which is what's happening now. And by the standards of the Middle East, that is good, and then solved at some point. But we, the Americans, will not make things better containing, let alone solving the problem by simply leaving.
Now, on that one, I don't even have to proceed, but one thing that comes out from my conversations with, friends and so here in Washington is that the only one that has close relationship with Turkey in the Trump presidency is Mr. Trump himself, and the rest has significant issues with Turkish President Erdogan and the way how he's governing the country, starting with Tulsi Gabbard, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and whatnot. How do you approach to such descriptions?
Okay.
Does it make any difference?
A, it does. B, by far the most important decision maker in any American administration is the president. That's very much the case with President Trump. I worked with him for 2 years. He does have a close relationship with President Erdogan. In fact, he often does what President Erdogan suggests, which has led to some friction at times on Syria, and we all know the history. But that said, it is, I think, a pretty close relationship. I think President Trump looks at things from a realpolitik standpoint, as does President Erdogan. So that's good. Now, I've seen these reports, but I look at them from the standpoint of 40 years of following American views towards Turkey. There are people who, and I won't name them, are always hostile against the state of Turkey for basic reasons. And they'll keep on coming up with new reasons to be against Turkey. Then there are others who, when Turkey does something that people don't like, they will speak out. You mentioned Mario Rubio. I had to testify before him over the Turkish incursion in October 2019, and he was very unhappy with what Turkey did. But he also knows that we in Turkey resolved that.
That's the Operation Peace, right?
Yes, in the negotiations between Vice President Pence and President Erdogan, and the situation has been basically stable since then. So I don't think that is anything to criticize Turkey about. I don't think Rubio said it. So if you go back to how did people look at Turkey in October of 2019? Well, everybody was unhappy, beginning with President Trump. Remember, he slapped those very powerful economic sanctions on Turkey. But that was
interesting times.
And then 3 weeks later, we got everything fixed. That's how adult countries, serious countries work. So I would not pick one statement by Mario Rubio and say Mario Rubio, is not a friend of Turkey. I think people spend too much time. Believe me, there are friends of Turkey in Washington, but even some of them, like Lindsey Graham. Go back and look at Lindsey Graham's discussion in the Senate Armed Services Committee with Secretary of Defense, I believe it was Esper in 2016, where Graham pressed Esper on supporting the SDF and got Esper to say that the SDF had connections with the PKK. And Graham said, well, I'm concerned about the impact on Ankara. So you would say Lindsey Graham, is a friend of Turkey. Yet Lindsey Graham was also very critical of the Turkish intervention.
There is also another rumor, it's not confirmed, but I got it from a source, that Tulsi Gabbard had invited Mazlum Kobani to attend the president's, swearing-in ceremony on January the 20th, and that it would also constitute I don't know whether that's right to say, but that's what the rumor is, that it would automatically mean that the Trump presidency does recognize this Kurdish autonomous region in northern Syria.
The American government has never deviated, including under President Trump, from a political solution for Syria in the aegis of UN Resolution 2254 from December of 2015.
Which was?
That was, you need new elections, you need a solution through a constitutional commission, through reconciliation between Assad and the Syrian opposition elements, of which one group is the SDF, but it's one of many. That has been the position of the United States. I don't want to comment on Tulsi Gabbard beyond saying it is very hard for me to imagine that she will be a major influence on President Trump's foreign policy.
Okay, that's good. Is there any, thing that you'd like to add before we wrap up this conversation to the Turkish audience when they're looking at these rough times? What should we, focus
on? First of all, few countries have been despite all of the things we've seen in the last 20 years, the outbreak of these major wars I mentioned, the COVID epidemic, frictions, questions about the United States. First of all, at the end of the day, the United States is still doing pretty much what it has been doing around the world since 1945, or actually since 1940. Two, the U.S. and Turkey are among the great winners of the last 30 years in terms of our economic development, our ability to preserve peace, and our ability to influence, in the case of Turkey, its region, in the case of the United States, because we're a bigger power, or a global power, the globe. Three, we have common foreign policy interests. We do not want to see these regional hegemons, and Turkey has one foot in Europe and the other foot in Asia, so it's facing two regional want-to-be hegemons, Russia and Iran. We do not want to see them expand through more war and more chaos, because that's the only way they can. The people of Europe and the people of the Middle East do not want to be dominated by either Russia or Iran, or anybody else, but the two who are actually trying to dominate right now are Russia and Iran. So that is another key interest between the United States and Turkey, and where I think this will play out best. I wish it could play out better in the Middle East, because I think our interests are aligned, but there, the issue of Hamas and the bad relations between a major Middle East player, Israel, and Turkey, reduce somewhat Turkey's flexibility. But with Ukraine, Turkey can play a very, very important role. It already has in the negotiations. It's the only country that's a serious player that can talk to both Zelensky and Putin. It has shown this repeatedly in the almost successful ceasefire negotiations in the spring of 2022 when the war began, in the grain negotiations, and in various other deals. I think that President Trump will be very interested in the role that Turkey can play in resolving the Ukraine war, because he is very serious about trying to resolve it.
Thank you so
How's
much,
that?
Ambassador. That's
Okay.
fantastic. Thank you so much
Okay.
for your time. Well, thank you so much for
Sure.
listening to us. So I'll do the translation, and it will appear as subtitles in the next
Okay.
48
And
hours.
if you can send it, I don't know, don't bother sending it to me because I don't do YouTube. Just if something comes up and I'm criticizing the Turkish press, we'll have to go back and look at the because there's many things I've said that people will take